Hello, I'm here with Ryveena Altman. Very excited to have this time to get to know you more and have others get to know you more. When I first met you, I was so excited to meet someone who is a bioethicist because I had no idea what that was. And I care a lot about health and well being. And when I thought about what you did to help people preparing to be in the medical industry, to understand the ethics of that, it's like, wow, this is really important work. But it doesn't just stop there. In terms of the medical industry, you have interest in artificial intelligence, technology, social issues. So it's a fascinating field. I want to know more about it, and I want people who are watching to know more about you and bioethics. So could we start with that? Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. Um, yeah, bioethics is a pretty broad field. It deals with ethical issues in life sciences primarily, but often with an emphasis on the medical field or on medical technology. So it's a good intersection between my interest in um, medical technology and social justice issues.
So medical technology, you mean things like having pacemakers and the technology used to do surgery or all of that?
Yeah, things like that. I mean, it has a lot to do with life and death conversations, with sort of the viability of different options in healthcare, with patient autonomy. Some really exciting questions right now are being raised about robotic assisted surgery. People feel a little strange, like they're being cut open by robots. But when we talk about, hey, like your medical outcomes are better if this is performed in a sterile environment. So it's the difference between how where people feel comfortable and where outcomes are, and how we can facilitate conversations around those. Yeah.
Hmm. Interesting. You said to me once that the bio part of ethics means just anything living. So are we talking about human beings only or just life?
Yeah, I mean, mostly we talk about things related to human beings because as humans, we're more concerned with ourselves than with anything else. But you can absolutely talk about bioethics as related to animal testing or personhood as it relates to animals.
Does it have anything to do with the environment?
Yeah, it certainly can, but primarily we talk about medicine and technology.
Interesting. I
Yeah,
noticed that. So for your undergraduate and graduate degree, your first ones, because you
yeah.
ended up getting another master's in public administration, but you were in philosophy. So I thought that was interesting that bioethics was a subset of philosophy, even though it has real practical applications, right? Because the things that
Yeah.
you're involved in as a bioethicist are practical in terms of people actually doing their work.
Yes. People have the impression that all philosophy is metaphysics and that we're concerned with the nature of the universe. I was always really concerned with the question of how we ought to live, and especially how we make the choice of how we want to live, and how other people decide those choices for themselves, and then how we come together as a society around those various decision making elements and structures. So ethics can be a very practical field of philosophy, and then especially as you get down into, I think, science, technology, bioethics, and disability ethics, which I focused on in my master's. I think it gets all the more practical. And then working as an applied ethicist, we worked directly in hospitals and in healthcare settings and with students who are now in med school working to become future doctors, or former students who are working in as nurses, PAs, physicians, DOs.
What would disability ethics mean?
Yeah, disability ethics is a really interesting field that a lot of people don't know much about. Um, the way that we treat people with less access to what we consider sort of a normal use of our bodies, and non-neurotypical people. Um, they have a different set of concerns, and when we other human beings, we sort of say that their needs aren't as important. And so disability ethics tries to combat that and says, how can we actually think deeply about what it's like to live in a differently abled body, what it's like to embody space in society and inside yourself, and how can we have meaningful conversations that allow uh, ableism to change.
Mm-hmm.
Disability ethics helped in the background of the Americans with Disabilities Act. When we talk, there's a thing called spoon theory, which has to do with how much capability one has in a day, which is it's a really neat example where people start out, like everybody starts out with a certain amount of spoons in the morning. It's a really great practical example to show people what it's like to live in a disabled body. Um, and it says like all of these different actions that occur in a day take up a certain amount of spoons, and it's going to the work or going to work, going to the gym, taking medication, any of these things. And if you start your day needing to exert extra energy to get out of bed, whether that's because you're facing depression or because it's physically harder for you, you lose spoons for that. You lose spoons if you need to remember to take your medication, if you need to remember to schedule a doctor's appointment, all of these different things. And so you can see really practically, oh, this person literally has less to deal with the other things that take up a person's day-to-day routine. And so things like that have come straight out of disability ethics conversations.
Great. So it really helps people understand the experience of the other so that when we're designing systems and experiences and
Yeah,
requirements and policies, that we have this idea that not everyone walks through the world in the same way, literally and
yeah,
figuratively, right? Yeah, really fascinating. One of the other areas that you mentioned that you have been involved in is social justice activism. And it seems like these things are very related because you just talked about, there's
yeah,
obviously social justice activism around disability, around race, around gender. So
yeah.
say a little bit about how your bioethics background involves social justice activism.
Yeah, I feel like everything that I'm interested in as a human being somehow ends up all linked together. So primarily the activism that I've been interested in and have participated in to a large extent has to do with minority access to healthcare and an understanding of what healthcare looks like if you are marginalized socioeconomically as well. So I've worked with LGBTQA groups, especially the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and also a Santa Cruz-based needle exchange, which a friend of mine started, and I do a lot of consulting with, to try to make sure that people have access to whatever they need to get through their lives safely. One of the things, like I was homeless as a young teenager, and one of the things that I realized is that people see unhoused populations as inherently unstable or dangerous, as people who will take without ever giving, and in like when you see people through that lens, you also think that they're deserving of less, when instead these are
Mm,
people who need support, and often have significantly less access to it through traditional healthcare. So when we
interesting.
talk about like safe use spaces or clean injection sites, needle exchanges, safe sex practices, all of that's
Mhm.
really important.
Great. Yeah, this is a really important piece that you're bringing up, the ethics of access. So we're dealing with it right now
Yeah,
in terms of healthcare in this country, obviously, but also even just around this terrible pandemic and the
yeah,
access to testing and vaccines, because we're finding that traditionally disenfranchised communities are continuing to be disenfranchised when it comes to access to testing or the vaccine. So these ethics and the conversations around them really can make a difference in the body politic about what they
very
end
much so.
up doing, right? Right.
And to even add to that example, it's in even being taken seriously that you have an issue that's not related to other things in your life. I've been collecting a lot of testimonials throughout the pandemic, and uh, a great friend of mine is both trans and Black, and they've been told that the issues they've been experiencing can't possibly be long COVID, even though it matches every single symptom, but it must be because their hormones aren't properly aligned, or it must be because their levels are off. And, that may be because of their race rather than they've been sick for a year with what we're identifying as a very serious problem related to COVID,
Mm-hmm.
but their pain isn't being taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being shuffled off into other people's buckets to deal with because the system is feeling overwhelmed and people don't know what to do, and so they say like, oh, you have a convenient othering that I can use to just make you somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have lots of work to do there. And
Yeah.
to that end, you've had some really, challenging conversations that you facilitated because it's one of your expertises is to really understand the nuances of how to navigate some of these challenging discussions. Can you say a little bit about what a bioethicist does when it comes to challenging conversations, the kind of conversations, or maybe even an example?
Yeah, a lot of difficult conversations come into play when someone's experiencing a serious healthcare problem, and especially if there's a cultural barrier, and either they don't understand their physician or their physician doesn't understand them. Sorry. Um, when when these things come together, when there's a lack of cultural competence on the role of the healthcare provider toward their patient, they're going to they're going to not see options that are available, and they're going to make assumptions about a patient based on their misunderstanding of who that patient is. So we'll see people offered solutions that are like culturally abhorrent to them, and or like, here's a good example. If you have someone coming from a low income Hispanic neighborhood, uh, a really great thing that a provider can do if they understand the neighborhood and they understand like the community itself. This is an example that I saw through my students on some of their rotations. Is the provider would say, rather than saying, okay, take this medication 3 times a day at these certain times and take it with food, uh, they would say, hey, what is your family dynamic look like? What is your kid's schedule? How many jobs are you working? And can we come up with a schedule that actually works for your family? Which is a question that is simple to ask, but requires knowing the dynamic of the population that you're working with.
Yes.
Because if you're working with a really advantaged population, you can make assumptions oftentimes that you have a parent at home or that there's after school care in the home, that a family looks a certain way. And that assumption is often incorrect, in other cultures and in other income levels.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I'm really getting a sense that this idea of bioethics has a lot to do with empathy and compassion and asking right and good questions of
Yeah.
people. We obviously are dealing with that when it comes to access to Wi-Fi and technology for students right now who are
Yeah.
having school at home and parents who are not present and can't be present and there's not daycare. So
Yeah.
this is really an exciting field that you're in, and I think more people who are trained in bioethics would benefit our all of our corporations, all of our organizations, and the overall government in this country and around the world. So I'm really glad you're doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was so good to talk to you a little bit. We'll have probably another conversation because I'm fascinated by this subject. And maybe we'll just take a deep dive next time into some specifics about things that have faced you and you've dealt with and how the ethics of it played out, because I think that's a complicated and wonderful discussion for us to have as well. But I appreciate your time and I
You
look
too.
forward to checking in with you again.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.